Johnson was not himself that afternoon. No man was himself then. In Dallas, the national interest required strength, not elegance, and it is arguable that Johnson, far from taking over too quickly, did not take over quickly enough. The United States needed a president, yet neither he nor his advisors had fully grasped the fact of Kennedy's death. Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess Cannell, and if you are new, then welcome. I hope to earn your subscription today. We are in, I believe, part 5 of this fascinating series. It was actually published in Look magazine in 1967. It's a serialized book by a man named William Manchester. He was asked by Jackie to look through and dig through and produce an account of the assassination that happened in Dallas. And so he published a book, but he apparently contracted with Look magazine to do a serialized portion of his book in their magazine. And so that's what we are working through. In today's, we start out. The body has not yet been transported to the airport, but Secret Service has been transferred to LBJ. He has not yet taken the oath of office, and yet he is the acting president. So that's where we are in this story. It's interesting to look through these old magazines. You guys know I love the old advertisements. Here is a classic. Look at that television and radio unit. Did any of you have that? I remember my grandfather had a big stereo system that he put in one of these, and I still remember him listening to the old jazz music and different songs that he liked, and the bass was so strong in that thing, and he would use his hand and bounce it on the table while we listened to old music. So today we are on chapter 9, I believe. No, we've gone through 4 and 6. Today, we're in part 3 of the printing, which is our part 5. The title of this is A Troubled Flight from Dallas, the desperate exit from Parkland Hospital, the swearing in, the abrasive relationship between Kennedy and Johnson partisans. Lyndon Johnson's departure from Parkland Hospital resembled one of those Chaplin-esque farewells in which the only people who wind up on the mobbed train are those who have come down to see their friends off. The exodus was accompanied by episodes of disorder, hubbub, and unexpected bungling. Suddenly, said Congressman Henry Gonzalez, I saw the might and power of the United States in complete confusion. Congressman Albert Thomas, quite by accident, wound up in the lead car as a human shield. Agent Rufus Youngblood led the new chief executive to Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry. The threat of a plot still obsessed the agent, who had insisted upon 2 automobiles. If a sniper recognized Mrs. Johnson, he would be shooting at the wrong car. Youngblood put Congressman Homer Thornberry beside Chief Curry, got in back with Johnson, and told the president to crouch down below window level. Because Johnson obeyed, Congressman Thomas, emerging from the hospital, didn't see him. Stop, Thomas shouted. Keep going, Youngblood called to Curry. From the floor, Johnson inquired, Who is it? The agent told him, and Johnson, asserting himself for the first time, said, Then stop. Making the best use of the delay, Youngblood decided to use every inch of flesh as protection. He directed Thomas to sit in front, pulled Thornberry into the rear, and arranged Johnson's shoulders so that he was in the middle. Any bullet aimed at the president would at first have to pass through Curry or one of the 2 congressmen or Youngblood. We took off, Texas Congressman Jack Brooks later recalled, like a stripe-assed ape. Actually, there were several exasperating delays. Curry had just begun to accelerate when a delivery truck appeared out of nowhere and halted right in front of him. The agents went for their guns, but the delivery man was guilty only of extremely bad traffic matters. A moment later, Curry destroyed the purpose of the unmarked cars by hitting his siren. Stop that! Johnson and Youngblood yelled together. The chief did. The motorcycle escort, however, had picked up his cue. The wails were audible for over a mile, and Curry had to radio them to cut it out. Thereafter, things went more smoothly, though at times they had to slow to a crawl. To those who were listening intently for rifle shots, these pauses were almost unbearable, and the trip seemed longer than it was. It's really not a long drive between where Parkland was and Love Field. It's a matter of a couple of miles at most, depending on your route. Youngblood, as they alighted at Love Field, Youngblood shouted, "Everybody run up the steps." Everybody did. And then Johnson headed for the television set, which was tuned to Walter Cronkite. "Close all the shades on the plane," the president was calling. "Close the shades," Youngblood echoed, a subtle change from Parkland. Obeying, an agent beheld a remarkable sight. An automobile, in violation of all military and civilian safety rules, was racing toward him across the breadth of Love Field. It was the last car in President Johnson's first motorcade. No one in it had protested when Agent Lem Johns, who thought that aircraft 26,000 had been moved to Love's private plane terminal, cried in exasperation, "Hell, we're on the wrong side of the airport. Let's shoot the runways." The control tower looked down in awe as they veered across the expanse of oil-stained concrete, their sirens screaming, and swerved up beside the ramp. With this hair-raising arrival from Parkland, the Youngblood breakout, as it might be called, was complete. Parkland didn't know it, though. Most of the agents and aides in the emergency area were under the impression that the group that had begun the grand tour of Texas at San Antonio International Airport the day before was still intact. And when they did hear of the lightning move later, they were indifferent to it. The man they still regarded as president lay dead. They couldn't think beyond that. To those who loved John Kennedy, the transition of power seemed needlessly cruel. Consolidating the two groups on one airplane was to prove extremely unfortunate, and aspects of Johnson's behavior in a very understandable state of shock may have proven exacerbating. But the difficulty there was largely one of manners and mannerisms. Johnson was not himself that afternoon. No man was himself then. In Dallas, the national interest required strength, not elegance, and it is arguable that Johnson, far from taking over too quickly, did not take over quickly enough. The United States needed a president, yet neither he nor his advisors had fully grasped the fact of Kennedy's death. Jack Valenti spoke for the majority of them when he burst into 26,000's stateroom and said, "I got here as quick as I could, Mr. Vice President." Over the far Pacific, another Boeing 707, identical to Air Force One, was racing homeward with 6 members of the cabinet. Orville Freeman slumped in his seat beside Janie Freeman. She reached over and squeezed his hand. "I'm so glad you weren't made VP in LA. I'm selfish." He nodded. Then his mind raced back to the convention in Los Angeles where he had been mentioned as a possible vice presidential candidate. Had events taken a different turn, Freeman reflected, the new occupant of the White House might well be named President Orville Freeman. He mused absently. Isn't that something? On a pad, he scribbled Janie's remark and added beneath it, "Thought then in my mind, too. What if? What would I do?" For John McCormick, the confirmation of John Kennedy's death was a private anticlimax. The speaker was in the House restaurant when 2 reporters came to a table and said that Kennedy had been shot. Other reporters and congressmen then began to dart up with bits and pieces of information. Reporters of the appearance of priests at Kennedy's bedside convinced McCormick that the president had succumbed. Then in the next minute, he was told that the vice president had been shot. And in the minute after that Secret Service agents were on their way to the Hill to protect him. The Speaker of the House is third in line of succession. Under the Succession Act of July 18, 1947, the Speaker was second in line of succession, and if both Kennedy and Johnson had been murdered, McCormick was now President of the United States. The possibility that in the next minute he was told that the Vice President had been shot and in the minute after that Secret Service agents were on their way to the Hill to protect him. Under the Succession Act of July 18, 1947, the Speaker was second in line of succession. And if both Kennedy and Johnson had been murdered, McCormick was now President of the United States. The possibility struck McCormick, he later recalled, with a terrific impact. He rose unsteadily from his chair and immediately suffered a severe attack of vertigo. Linen, waiters, tableware swam before his eyes. He thought he was going to lose consciousness and tumble to the floor. Passing a palsied hand over his eyes, he sank back to his seat, and he was still there trembling when a congressman called over that Johnson was unharmed. Senator Barry Goldwater, who admired and liked John Kennedy, expressed his outrage and canceled all his public appearances. Not all Goldwater admirers shared his wrath, however. An Oklahoma City physician beamed at a grief-stricken visitor and said, "Good, I hope they got Jackie." In a small Connecticut city, a doctor called ecstatically across Main Street to an internist who worshipped Kennedy. "The joy ride's over. This is one deal Papa Joe can't fix." A woman visiting Amarillo was lunching in a restaurant when a score of students burst in from a high school directly across the street. "Hey, great, JFK's croaked," one shouted with delight. And the woman, leaving as rapidly as she could, noticed that several diners were smiling back at the boy. In a wealthy Dallas suburb, the pupils of a fourth grade class, told that the President of the United States had been murdered in their city, burst into spontaneous applause. During a meeting at the Cosmos Club that was brought to the attention of the FBI in Washington 6 months after the tragedy, a retired Marine Corps general told an admiring group of retired military officials it was the hand of God that pulled the trigger that killed Kennedy. Bob Kennedy had been dressing for a flight to Dallas when he received word that the brilliant world he had loved and known was finished. The White House extension on the desk at his home in Virginia rang, and he dove for it and listened for a moment. The call was from Captain Tazewell Shepard, the presidential naval aide. "Oh, he's dead," he cried. And then he added to Ethel and the CIA director, John McCone, "He had the most wonderful life." Later, that would be his wife's most vivid recollection of his response, how in the starless night he remembered how bright the sun had been. Bob, Ethel, and McCone descended the stairs and walked to the rear porch. Kennedy poked his head in the window of the living room where several close friends were watching the television commentary. "He died," he said in a low voice and walked toward the pool. The extension out by the pool rang. It was J. Edgar Hoover. The most important detail he had promised to try to get during an earlier conversation with the Attorney General had just come through. "The president's dead," he said snappily, and hung up. He expressed no compassion. He did not seem to be upset. Ordinary garrulous, Hoover had suddenly turned curt with his superior. It would be charitable to attribute the swift change to the stresses of the afternoon. Yet, although Bob Kennedy continued in the cabinet for over 9 months, Hoover, whose office was on the same floor, never walked over to offer his condolences. One of his assistants wrote Kennedy a moving letter, and the agents in the FBI's crime squad sent him a message of sympathy, but their director remained sphinx-like. Outwardly, Bob Kennedy was more collected than his callers, most of whom had rushed over on impulse and found on arrival that they didn't know what to say. To some of his friends, his manner suggested that he was more concerned with their loss than with his own, an attitude that was to be characteristic of Jacqueline Kennedy throughout the weekend, and that, for many, was shattering. "We don't want any gloomy faces around here," he told Dave Hackett lightly, and his greeting to his aide, Ed Guthman, 10 minutes after the call from Hoover, was almost casual. "How are you doing?" he asked. "I've seen better days," Guthman replied, adopting his low key. "Don't be sad. Pretty hard not to." Chapter 2 of today's reading. When Jack Valenti entered the stateroom of Air Force One, the attention of the vice president, as everyone continued to call the new president, was riveted on the television screen. Johnson was hoping that Walter Cronkite would tell him what was going on. Those who have never been in the eye of a historic storm may find this hard to believe, but the value of even the most perceptive eyewitnesses comes later, when their recollections can be matched against one another in tranquility. As long as events are still unfolding, the observations of each individual are as meaningless as a single jagged fragment in a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. There are certain situations in which the fitting of grooves can begin at once. That is the job of intelligence. And it would have been possible if the assassination had occurred in the White House, with its magnificently equipped Situation Room. In Dallas, however, there was no Situation Room, only the situation itself. If Dallas had been surrounded, the New York studios of CBS would have been a lot likelier to know of it than anyone within shouting distance of the 37th Vice President, now become the 36th President of the United States. At that moment, however, the networks knew nothing Johnson did not know. He turned away, relieved. The big picture was not as frightening as it had seemed in imagination, unless, of course, the commentators were also in the dark. Actually, much was happening that was unknown to both Johnson and Cronkite. 20 minutes before the Johnson party boarded the plane, a policeman named J.D. Tippett had been shot to death 2 miles from the Texas Schoolbook Depository. Another 40 minutes were to pass before anyone saw the significance of Officer Tippett's death. It was logical to suppose that the great crime had been committed by a great criminal, backed perhaps by a criminal nation. If that were true, the grand design would be revealed in grand fashion, not in the petty killing of a patrolman. Rufus Youngblood's hour in history was nearly over. Once the new chief executive felt secure, the Secret Service was destined to fade back into the shadows. And for Lyndon Johnson, security returned when he had been extricated from the vortex of Dallas. Only a return to the city could renew the threat, and he had no intention of flirting again with whatever dark forces lurked in those sunlit streets. He had been badly scarred. 10 months later, he was invited to address an American Legion National Convention in Dallas at the height of the presidential campaign. To the dismay of the Legion and the chagrin of the city's civic leaders, he refused. The Youngblood Protectorate, which had begun on Elm Street at 12:30, ended in the stateroom of 26,000 when the agent first insisted that the Johnson family move directly into the White House upon arrival in the Capitol. To him, the suggestion was just another safety precaution. Johnson saw that it had other implications, some of them exceedingly delicate, and he flatly rejected it. That was at approximately 1:43 p.m. Wow. On the couch opposite the stateroom desk, Mrs. Johnson fingered her choker of pearls and jotted down notes. She overheard, quote, the agonized voice, end quote, of a Secret Service man crying that the service had never lost a president before, and she hurt for him. She was aware of her husband moving restlessly from chair to couch to chair, ordering coffee, bouillon, Poland water. She intercepted a message from Parkland. Mrs. Kennedy wouldn't move from major medicine without the body. Johnson let it be known that 26,000 wouldn't budge. They were going to wait on the gallant lady and the coffin. The stateroom's occupants kept loosening their collars and mopping their foreheads. Mrs. Johnson alone felt chilled. We've been told in other accounts that it was like a steamy cabin, that the sun was just baking down onto the fuselage, and that it was just the sweatiest, most humid imaginable thing. On top of all the grief they would have been feeling, that would make it incredibly just a frustrating, maddening place to be. She listened to her husband canvassing 3 congressmen on the question of where he should be sworn in. He was requesting their opinions without disclosing his own. Jack Brooks, an impulsive ex-Marine, was a partisan of the instant oath. Homer Thornberry counseled, let's wait until Washington. Albert Thomas sided with Brooks. Suppose the plane is delayed, he asked Johnson. echoing the convictions of the correspondents at Parkland. The country can't afford to be without a president while you're flying all over the country. The debate itself was probably of little consequence. Johnson's mind seemed to be made up. To Thomas, he said, "I agree. Now, what about the oath?" They looked blank. Throats were cleared, limp ties loosened, but no one spoke. Here he was seeking not a consensus, but hard information, and the Texas congressman hadn't any. The best they could offer were fuzzy memories of textbook engravings of Chester Arthur or Calvin Coolidge, who, in the dancing illumination of defective lamplight, had affixed his hand to a shabby family Bible, while strangers in old-fashioned nightshirts stood around gaping. Everyone agreed that there was an official in the picture. His identity, however, was obscure. He could have been a Supreme Court justice or a notary public. The oath itself eluded them entirely. Johnson was not limited to the passengers in 26,000's main cabin, however. Learning that the communications shack was in contact with Washington, he eagerly looked around for telephones. The closest one hung from a hook on the other side of the aisle. He ignored it. Possibly he could not yet bring himself to sit at Kennedy's stateroom desk, though the more plausible explanation is that he wanted solitude. In any event, the instrument he did use was also on a presidential desk. It was indeed in Kennedy's private quarters, which, as he had told Mrs. Johnson and Air Force One Steward Sergeant Joe Ayers earlier, he preferred to avoid. Although he himself informed this writer that he could not even recall the precise sequence of calls that he made, he was never entirely alone, and in all important instances there are the recollections of the person to whom he talked. A moment after Lyndon Johnson found the telephone, the first issue of his administration arose. It was a prickly one because the man to whom the new president now turned was the one member of the cabinet who was entitled to sit out the transition. The question Johnson had asked of the congressman was constitutional, which meant that it had to be resolved by the lawyer who had been John Kennedy's attorney general and was now automatically Lyndon Johnson's. That he should be the dead president's brother was cruel mischance, yet the incoming chief had no option. Seated at the end of Jacqueline Kennedy's bed with Rufus Youngblood standing against the wall, he accordingly placed a call to Robert Kennedy in Virginia. Johnson began by expressing his condolences, but he had just become the busiest man in the world, and after a few compassionate sentences, he plunged into business. The murder, he said, quote, might be part of a worldwide plot. In Johnson's statement to the Warren Commission 7.5 months later, he suggested that the Attorney General had agreed with this interpretation and had discussed the practical problems at hand, problems of special urgency, because we did not at that time have any information as to the motivations of the assassination or its possible implications. In fact, Kennedy was unresponsive. He was not among those who suspected a grand conspiracy, and he didn't understand what Johnson was talking about. "A lot of people down here think I should be sworn in right away," said the new president, moving closer to the point. "Do you have any objections to that?" Kennedy was taken aback. It was scarcely an hour and a quarter since he had first heard of the shooting, less than an hour since he had learned that the wound had been fatal. As Attorney General, he couldn't understand the need for a rush, and on a personal level, he preferred that any investiture be deferred until his brother's body had been brought home. "Congressman Albert Thomas thinks I should take the oath here," said Johnson, citing support. "A lot of other people feel the same way." The phone by the Kennedy pool remained silent. Kennedy did not dissent. He said nothing. Changing to another tack, Johnson again referred to the plot, and then he requested information. According to Youngblood, he asked questions about who, when, and how he should take the presidential oath. Kennedy heard, "Who could swear me in?" "I'll be glad to find out and call you back," he answered. He depressed his receiver and asked the operator for his deputy, Nick Katzenbach. He told Nick, "Lyndon wants to be sworn in Texas and wants to know who can administer the oath." "My recollection is that anyone can administer the oath who administers oaths under federal or state laws," Katzenbach said. "Do you want to hold on while I check?" Bob did, and using another line, Nick called Harold Rees in the department's Office of Legal Counsel. "That's right," said Rees. He reminded Katzenbach that Coolidge had been sworn in by his own father, a justice of the peace, and he added, "Of course, the oath's in the Constitution." He was the man Johnson should have been talking to. A great many eminent attorneys, Robert Kennedy among them, were so shaken that they had forgotten where they could lay their hands on the oath. Waiting for the Attorney General to phone back, Johnson was using other lines in an attempt to find out what was in any copy of the World Almanac. While he was talking to presidential aide McGeorge Bundy, Nick Katzenbach had checked back with Bob Kennedy and confirmed his earlier opinion. "Then any federal judge can do it?" Kennedy asked. "Anybody, including a district court judge." Nick added, "I imagine he'll want Sarah Hughes." Sarah was from Dallas, and he remembered Johnson's vigorous lobbying for her appointment. Inside his library, Robert Kennedy signaled the White House operator who interrupted Johnson's Bundy conversation and connected the new president with his attorney general. The crux of their exchange is unclear. The second Johnson-Kennedy colloquy has two renditions. According to the president's subsequent statement to the Warren Commission, Kennedy advised him that the oath should be administered to me immediately before taking off for Washington, and that it should be administered by a judicial officer of the United States. Youngblood's memory is foggy. He tends to support his superior with qualifications, but he explains quite reasonably that he heard only one voice. Kennedy, who was on the other end, does not remember recommending an immediate ceremony, and it should be noted that such a recommendation would have been inconsistent with his mood. It is of his recollection and that of Ed Guthman, who was with him, that he said, "Anybody can swear you in. Maybe you'd like to have one of the judges down there whom you appointed. Any one of them can do it." He was asked about the wording of the oath. "You can get the oath," he said. "There's no problem about the oath. They can locate the oath." "Fine," said Johnson, and rang off. But it wasn't fine. He still lacked the text. In the stateroom, Johnson aide Cliff Carter said to Marie Famer, "You'd better go in. He's making calls." She saw Johnson on the bed and sat in the chair facing it. The desk and telephone were between them. "Write this down," Johnson told her. He dictated brief notes of his talks with his aide Walter Jenkins and with McGeorge Bundy and with the Attorney General, and said, "Now, let's get Waddy Bullion." J.W. Bullion was a Dallas lawyer who had been counsel to Mrs. Johnson for 23 years. His secretary said he was in Shreveport on business. "Get Sarah Hughes," Johnson said. Sarah's law clerk, John Spinuzzi, explained that she was out. The last he knew, she was on her way to the Trade Mart lunch. The new president took the receiver from his secretary. "This is Lyndon Johnson," he said tersely. "Find her." Then to Marie, "Try Irv Goldberg." Goldberg, another local attorney and veteran of Johnson's Texas political campaigns, was at home watching his television set. The phone there rang. His secretary said excitedly, "The Dallas White House is trying to reach you." Her voice faded and was succeeded by static. It was a very poor connection. And then a faint but familiar voice came on. "This is Lyndon. Do you think I should be sworn in here or in Washington?" Irv thought rapidly. "I think here." "Who should do it?" "Sarah Hughes. We're trying to get her here. You try too." Barefoot Sanders, the U.S. attorney, should have been able to provide the oath, but he had become overwhelmed by finer points of law in the hope of establishing federal jurisdiction over an assassin. He was rummaging through statute volumes from 3 libraries when a clerk said, "Hey, what about the Constitution?" "Of course," said Barefoot, feeling foolish. As U.S. Judge for the Northern District of Texas, Sarah, whom Sanders had finally located, had more legal rank than he did, and she had not only forgotten the Constitution, she had decided that since the essentials of every oath are pretty much the same, the exact wording didn't matter. "I was not afraid," she recalled afterward. "I could do it without a formal oath. I could make one up." Driving toward the airport in her red sports car, she was more concerned about speed. She had known Lyndon Johnson since 1943 and said, "I knew he would want things in a hurry. That's the way he is." He also liked for things to be done properly, however. And fortunately for those who do not view the wording of the U.S. Constitution so lightly, he was covering all bases. At 3:20 in Washington, Katzenbach's phone rang. It was the Dallas White House continuing its tireless search for a lawyer who knew precisely what a president should say on assuming office. "Hold on," Nick said, "and I'll dictate it." Lyndon Johnson moved into the stateroom. "I've just talked to the Attorney General, and he has advised me that I should be sworn in here," he told Valenti. The sound of the television set a few feet away became conspicuous, as though someone had just turned up the volume. At present, the commentators were confused, but in downtown Dallas, the news had just taken a dramatic turn. The police had entered a theater and arrested a man in the killing of policeman Tippit. 5 minutes before Katzenbach began dictating the oath to Marie, the homicide squad had learned that their new prisoner worked as a stockman in the Texas schoolbook depository and was, in fact, the only depository employee to have been missing when Superintendent Roy Truly counted heads a half hour after the assassination. The first faint light was entering what had, until now, been a pitch-black maze. Undertaker Vernon O'Neill is a cumbersome figure in the story of John Kennedy. Squat, hairy, and professionally doleful, with a thick Texas accent and gray hair parted precisely in the middle and slicked back, he was the proprietor of an establishment that might have been invented by Waugh or Huxley. It had a wall-to-wall carpeted slumber room, piped religious music, a coffee bar for hungry relatives of loved ones, and a fleet of white hearses. White, because the owner felt that death should never be depressing. A hustling businessman, O'Neill had 7 radio-equipped ambulance hearses and his own dispatcher. The dispatcher was tied into the police network because the concern had a contract with the city. In effect, it was a concession. Vernon O'Neill handled tragedies east of the Trinity River, and his chief competitor worked the West Bank. On the early afternoon of November 22nd, 17 of O'Neill's staff of 18 men were out to lunch. O'Neill gasped when his dispatcher told him that 601, the call number of the president's motorcade escort, was reporting a code 3, an alarm of the very highest priority. Then the telephone rang. "This is Clint Hill of the Secret Service. I want you to bring a casket out here to Parkland. I want you immediately." Hold on, O'Neill said. "We've got merchandise at all prices." "Bring the best one you have," said Clint. Running into his selection room, O'Neill chose his most expensive coffin, the Elgin Casket Company's Britannia model, 800 pounds of double-walled, hermetically sealed, solid bronze. But he couldn't carry it alone. He hurried out to his driveway and stood vigil there until he had collected 3 returning employees. The 4 of them eased the massive coffin into the pride of his vehicular fleet, a snow-white, air-conditioned 1964 Cadillac. At Parkland's ambulance dock, O'Neill and Ray Gleason, his bookkeeper, opened the back of the Cadillac. Agents and White House correspondents sprang forward to help them. The coffin was laid on the rubber cradle of one of the Undertaker's carts and wheeled down the long corridor. At the wide door, the correspondents stepped back. Agent Andy Berger signaled Ken O'Donnell. They were here. "I want to speak to you," Ken said to Mrs. Kennedy in an undertone, motioning her to follow him down the passage. She followed him to a door there, and then Pam Turner saw her reach out like a cat and grab the knob to be sure it was open. She had guessed correctly what was arriving, and that they wouldn't want her to see it. But Ken had made a promise that she would see her husband before the coffin was closed, and she intended to see that it was kept. Sergeant Kemp Clark appeared beside Ken. She appealed to the physician. "Please, can I go in?" No, he mumbled. She leaned toward him. "Do you think seeing the coffin can upset me, doctor? I've seen my husband die, shot in my arms. His blood is all over me. How can I see anything worse than I've seen?" Clark capitulated. All right, I know." He stepped aside. She was right behind O'Neill. Crossing the passage, she continued to ponder what she could put with the president. Suddenly, she thought of her wedding ring. Nothing had ever meant so much to her. Unlike her circlet set with emeralds, it was unadorned. It was, in fact, a man's wedding band. The president had bought it in a hurry in Newport just before their wedding. There hadn't even been time to put the date in. She had taken it to a jeweler and had that done later. The ring would be exactly right, provided she could get it off. She attempted to unfasten the left glove and couldn't even work the snap. They were inside the room now. Apart from the disinfectant and the blistering artificial light overhead, the place was much altered. It was nearly immaculate and almost empty. The audience of half an hour ago had dispersed. O'Neill was there, leaning over the burnished coffin. O'Donnell stood in the doorway. Dallas Police Sergeant Bob Duggar had followed her across the threshold. He looked competent, and drawing herself up, she held her wrist toward him. He understood. He found the snap with his thumbnail and unpeeled the glove. She moved to the president's side and lifted his hand tenderly. Then, when the ring was on, she released his hand and looked down. The president had come to Parkland in one clamorous outburst. He was about to leave it in another. O'Neill was concerned about the Britannia's pale satin upholstery. It was immaculate now, but could easily be stained. Motioning to orderly David Sanders, who was concerned that Mrs. Kennedy's ring might be lost and who had just succeeded in working it over the president's knuckle with cream, O'Neill directed him to line the inside of the coffin with a sheet of plastic. Nurses, Doris Nelson and Diana Bowron, swooped around, wrapping the body in a second plastic sheet. Then the Undertaker asked Doris to bring him a huge rubber sheath and a batch of rubber bags. Placing the sheath over the plastic lining, he carefully cut the bags to size, enveloping the president's head in them one by one until he had made certain that there would be 7 protective layers of rubber and 2 of plastic between the damaged scalp and the green satin. All this took 20 minutes. Mrs. Kennedy had returned to her chair looking, Gonzalez thought, like a wounded rabbit. To Henry and to the rest of the presidential party, John Kennedy's slender young widow had become a mystic symbol. They had never felt so close to another human being. They supposed that everyone else felt the same, and those who learned that they were mistaken were deeply shocked. Henry was the first of them. He was looking down a narrow hallway toward a room that physicians used to take emergency calls. A fragile nurse, patting a well-cherished head of blonde hair, and a youth with a thin, conceited face were standing there together. They had their arms around one another, a gesture, Henry assumed, of commiseration. Then the nurse smirked. The youth murmured something in her ear, and she giggled. Henry called indignantly, "Show a little respect, can't you?" They looked up, startled, and then vanished. To success that frivolity or incivility were dominant at Parkland would be a gross injustice. Most members of the staff were as bereft as their bewildered visitors and were doing their best to shape order out of unprecedented chaos. But accident rooms, like drunk tanks, are unlovely places. Some employees inevitably become hard-bitten. There were other incidents that grated, the resonant sound of baritone laughter echoing down one corridor, horseplay between 2 orderlies in a second, an exchange of colorful language from opposite ends of a third hall. Jacqueline Kennedy noticed none of this. By now, Major Surgery's Carnival House floor plan had been mastered by the Irish Mafia, the agents, and the military aides. They had her thoroughly sealed off. None of them liked the place, and there was a general feeling that waiting for the body was unnecessarily cruel for her, a viewpoint she did not share. "You could go back to that plane now," one of them said to her, and she replied again, "I'm not going back till I leave with Jack." But they believed that she was safe from intruders. Only a freak of chance could break the box they had built around her. But it was a freakish hour. A Catholic clergyman was probably the one stranger who could slip through the concentric circles of sentinels around her. The outer guards would conclude that the Catholic widow had sent for him. The Boston Irishmen, who were the closest to her, would defer to him. And this is precisely what happened, exposing Mrs. Kennedy to what would later be remembered as the episode of the priest. Presidential aides Ken O'Donnell, Larry O'Brien, and Dave Powers wondered whether he had been a real priest. No genuine cleric, they felt, could have behaved the way he did. He was real enough. Father Thomas Kane was the superior of the Dominican Fathers at the Roman Catholic University of Dallas, 6 miles from Parkland. He was also an eccentric, an energetic, bespectacled cigar smoker with thinning gray hair and a turkey gobbler neck. Father Kane was, even on serene days, a man of erratic mannerisms. He talked a great deal, sometimes disjointedly, gesticulating loopingly with his long arms, and he tended to swing between cycles of impulsive activity and remorse. When the academic dean of the university had called him at his priory, and told him of the shooting, he had but one thought. A Catholic president had been wounded, and he belonged at the president's side. The fact that other priests would be closer was irrelevant, for he had something they did not. In a green bag in his office, he kept an ornate crucifix, containing within it a minute splinter from the true cross encased in plastic. Changing to his robe and collar, Father Kane had pocketed the bag, bounded out of his car, and headed for the hospital. He drove the accelerator straight to the floor. It was, he admitted afterwards, something of a miracle that he wasn't killed. He left the car in the anarchy of badly parked automobiles and dashed in past the Dallas policemen, the shift commanded by Agent Roy Kellerman, the 2 uniformed generals, and the mafia. On the way, he heard someone say that the president was dead. Mrs. Kennedy looked up and saw him hovering over her. His eyes were wild. When did he die? In the car, I think, she said haggardly. Father Kane loosened the bag string. I have a relic of the true cross. He held it out and asked her to venerate it. She kissed the crucifix, not quite understanding what this was all about. Then he said he wanted to take it in to the president. She thought, this must mean a lot to this man, and if he wants to give it to Jack, how touching. O'Donnell nodded. The priest went in. But he didn't leave the relic. He merely walked around, waving it ceremoniously in the air above Vernon O'Neill, the nurses, the orderly, the plastic and rubber sheeting, and the 6 rubber head bags. Coming out, he said, I have applied a relic of the true cross to your husband. She stared. It was still in his hands. She thought, you mean you didn't even give it to him? O'Donnell edged toward him. Father Kane, however, wasn't to be dismissed that easily. He was dancing around in a state of excitement, his larynx bobbing. He pressed her hand and tried to put his arms around her, addressing her by her first name, calling her endearing names, and promising to write her a letter. Just as Ken and Larry and Dave thought they had the priest cornered, he jerked away from them. Scurrying back into the trauma room, he pranced around O'Neill, pranced out, confronted a group of hospital employees standing against a wall, and led them in a recitation of the Lord's Prayer. He returned to Mrs. Kennedy and reached for her hand again. She yanked it away. Please, Father, leave me alone. Now O'Donnell stalked him in earnest, and now he backed away, clutching the bag. They could hear his voice drifting across a cubicle wall, chanting prayers feverishly. They thought they were rid of him, but he was only a few feet away, and he had no notion of leaving. Wow, what a strange circumstance. And I've never read about that. Have you? Have you even heard of that? That there was a weird priest in that moment? My goodness, that was a really interesting set of chapters. Well, I think we have at least one more of these before we get into next week's reading. So come back for at least one more set of chapters, and I'll see you next time. Let me know in the comments what you appreciated about this episode, what stood out to you, not just the priest, but the details of getting the oath and how Robert Kennedy got the news and how the coffin came about and all of that. Just lots of interesting details about getting prepared to fly away from Dallas. You guys let me know what you noticed in the comments, and I'll see you there. Have a great day. Bye.